at the time I write, I just focus on recording the emotion. It's a better way for me because poetry captures and reflects emotions as well as it releases the emotions. I felt relieved after finished writing, and it works like a therapy for me.
This is Uyghur Stories. Stories from the Uyghur diaspora. Hi, John. How are you today?
Hi, I'm good, Mukaddas. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm feeling really great about our conversation today because there's something that is really mysterious for me and also very important for my research and artistic life. It's poetry.
Poetry.
Yes, poetry. And I know it's really important for a lot of people that I know from my community. And it was really important for my parents as well, when still important for them as well, of course. So that's something that I wanted to discuss and I want to learn from you as well, because I don't know what is your relationship to poetry and what is your surroundings is relationship to poetry.
Speaking for myself, growing up in America, poetry was something that always felt a little esoteric or a little inaccessible, maybe. We would study poetry in school. We would read sonnets by Shakespeare, or we'd, have to write haiku and things like that.
Mhm.
But I suspect that maybe that's not the same as your experience with Uyghur poetry.
Yeah, the poetry for me was always being a part of music, actually. My relationship with poetry is from songs, from muqams, from the parties that my parents threw when I was a kid, and a lot of people will come together and then they will sing this very nice words, and then we have this very intimate relationship to sang poetry. The words are really important, and the art of listening is really important. That's why we have so many traditional songs are actually from epic stories. So the poetic forms of these epic stories are always been the center of Uyghur culture, I would say.
I really like what you said about the art of listening, because that reveals something that I think is really important with Uyghur poetry that is maybe different from the Western tradition of poetry, which is that these poems are very much meant to be spoken or sung and heard, and that it's such an important part of the oral tradition of Uyghur culture. And in Western contexts, there are certainly poetry readings, and you might go to a cafe or a bookshop or something and hear someone read a poem, but I think a more typical way for a Westerner to interact with poetry would be simply to read it in a journal or a collection of poems. And it's maybe not as sort of archetypally about listening. It's maybe more about reading and sort of synthesizing within your mind. But what you're saying about having the experience, the art of listening, is, I think, really interesting, and it helps me understand a little bit better about why poetry is such an essential part of the Uyghur experience.
Yeah, exactly. I remember when I was still traveling through Uyghur region, meeting with some poets in Kashgar and spending time with them in cafes and in restaurants. And there's like followers all around these poets. And then all they want to do is listen to the poetry, and when the poet is reading the poem, like the level of like emotion from this listeners were really interesting for me as well, and they were like so highly absorbed into these words, and then they were like taking really this pleasure of listening to these poets reciting poem. And it was really, as you said, it's a tradition of spoken words as well, of course, but it's at the same time it cannot be existed without the person, the audience, who are listening to it. And then it's like a duo working together to circulate ideas and circulate emotions, and it's like shared experience for all.
So you mentioned how a lot of sort of traditional Uyghur poetry is based on the writings of Sufi scholars or clerics from the 14th and 15th century. Could we hear an example of what that kind of poetry sounds like?
Of course, we didn't have recordings from 14th or 15th century, but
Of course.
for my master's degree, I worked on a brotherhood in the northern part of the Uyghur region, and eventually, I was really lucky to be able to record one of the last master who still read, performed, and conducted all the Sufi rituals in the region. So here's a recording from him that I recorded. It was in 2006 or 7. So I would love to introduce you to Nurcan Hafiz.
Wow, that's incredible. And it's also incredible to watch him perform this. And obviously, this is a podcast, so our audience can't watch it, but we'll be sure to put this link up on our website so our audience can go watch him perform this in addition to listening to it. So what is the poem that he is singing there? What is it about?
It's a spiritual poem. It's like prayer, and it's something that they used in rituals, in a ritual called zikr. So he was explaining to me like how the zikr will work with the the brothers who will be there as well, listening and also reacting with their voice and also with their body. And he was also singing the melody with the poetic spiritual part on top of rhythmic humming from the brothers. Uyghur poetry is not only about classical music or classical way of delivering words or classical way of listening to poetry. It's also very contemporary, and it's also very vivid in contemporary Uyghur society. I talked to Joshua Freeman. He is a specialist on Uyghur poetry, and he's a lovely person, and he has been working on translating these poets' work since many years. And I would like to share some of our conversation about Uyghur contemporary poetry with him.
Great.
Sure. My name is Joshua Freeman. I am a historian. I focus on 20th century China and Inner Asia, and particularly Uyghur history. I'm also a translator of Uyghur poetry, which I've been doing for more than a decade now. I live in New Jersey. I teach at Princeton University. I've been here for about a year and a half now.
Can you please just share a memory about how you came to this subject and why you started to get interested in Uyghur poetry?
Sure. When I was first living in the Uyghur region and I learned the language, I started by reading novels in Uyghur. And I didn't find a lot of novels that I really liked. There were a few that I liked, but I was reading books, and I asked some of my friends there to recommend me, some more novels, and I, was asking why, why am I not finding more novels that really excite me in Uyghur? And my friends said, well, why are you just reading novels? Uyghurs have been writing novels for a few decades, but we've been writing poetry for a millennium. What you really should be doing is reading poetry. So I started reading Uyghur poetry, and in particular, one friend of mine recommended that I read the work of Tayramut and Peratursun. So I remember when I was first reading their work, that would have been, I think, 2006, maybe 2007. And I remember the effect that it had on me. The first few poems of theirs that I read, I'd never read anything quite like that before. And the effect that it had on me, the power that I found in that poetry is something that I still feel when I read it. I was just struck by the power of what I was reading, and my sort of immediate reaction was that I wanted to translate it because I wanted, some friends back in the U.S. to be able to read it. And as far as I knew, there weren't any translations into English of Uyghur poetry, or very few. So I started just doing that in my free time. And I did just a few at first and just sent them to my friends, and I had no particular intention of publishing them. In the process of translating, though, you learn a lot about a language, and you learn a lot about what you're translating, the sort of text that you're translating. So I think for me, because this is probably, I was reading this poetry probably within the first couple of years that I had learned Uyghur and was beginning to use this language. Um, I think for me, the process of translating poetry has always been connected to my, gaining a greater understanding of the language. And I feel like I've learned so much of what I know about the Uyghur language through reading poetry. And it's much more than language, of course. It connects to the farthest reaches of culture. It connects to individual experiences. It connects to communal experiences. It connects to history. It connects to the present. It connects to hopes and fears for the future. And poetry is so central, I think, to Uyghur culture, and it's so important in Uyghur society that for me, translating it has been this really special and really fulfilling way to come to understand, the culture as a whole. It's a constant experience of mine that I'll read a poem by somebody in, say, the refugee community in Turkey that I'd never heard of before, and it'll be a great poem, and I'll get in touch with them, and they'll have a bunch of other stuff to show me. Um, so I think that's I think that says a lot about the vibrancy and the power and the kind of just social pervasiveness of Uyghur poetry. That's a really special thing. You certainly couldn't say that about poetry in the United States. We certainly have some amazing poets in the U.S., but it's definitely not the case that every American knows some poetry, and that it's definitely not the case that poetry is part of our everyday life here in the same way. It's something that um, that the world, I think, really has to learn from Uyghur poetry and Uyghur culture and Uyghur society.
Why is that though? I'm wondering, is it because we have so many restrictions in, like, not only political restrictions, but also being kind of traditional society? And maybe poetry is a way to say things that we cannot really express normally in a normal conversation, or in a novel, or in a any form of written documents, or like even in a conversation in between friends. Is it because of that, because there's so many possibility to say things with few words, but without saying actually or without pronouncing actual struggle. So is it because of that?
The kind of oral transmission of poetry allows for things to bypass censors. It allows for things to be transmitted even when maybe you don't have access to a printing press. And so I think that that is probably part of it. And also, of course, in poetry, you can express a lot of things by implication, and sort of get your work by the censors that way. On the other hand, there are plenty of works of prose fiction in Uyghur too, that express political ideas, by way of implication and analogy. So I don't think that this can really entirely explain why poetry is so special in Uyghur and so powerful. Uyghur society is not the only community in which poetry is extremely important. There are many other societies in the world where that's the case, particularly in the Islamic world, in a lot of Slavic countries, and many other parts of the world where oral culture is still very lively and powerful. But if you just, for example, just think about kind of Islamic Central Asia, poetry's been really central in both high culture and folk culture for many centuries. So to some degree, poetry's prestige and its power in Uyghur culture is sort of one example of that. But that said, I do think that poetry has particular power and vibrancy in Uyghur society.
Writing poetry in Uyghur homeland nowadays is really complicated because Uyghur language being really closely monitored and people like students cannot speak Uyghur in schools. So it's hard to imagine people continue writing poetry. Maybe they're writing in their head, in their heart, but they're not publishing any and they're not externalizing anything.
Mm-hmm.
But Josh was mentioning a kind of really interesting poets living outside of Uyghur homeland and writing poetry. And he said, there's so many people writing poetry, and I'm discovering like each day or each week some new poets writing poetry.
Yeah, that's really exciting.
Yeah, it is a very interesting and exciting phenomenon because we know growing up in Uyghur region, we know that there were poets who lived outside of Uyghur homeland. And by saying that, I'm thinking about poets who lived in Central Asian part, like in Kazakhstan or in Kyrgyzstan. We have a huge community over there as well. So some poets are really important in Uyghur community living in those countries, and there often these poetries is about homeland. It's about nostalgia. It's about willing to return and willing to have a country and willing to embrace this land. And there's one special one is that I really like, and it's sang again by a very beautiful singer that I admired who had a very interesting life, and she passed away a little bit more than a year ago, and she's a legend. And I would like to share this poem, this song, which is about missing homeland and asking the audience, did you miss me? I missed you. Did you miss me? That's the whole idea of the poem.
Wow, that's really beautiful. And that audio that you just heard came from a video that Mukaddas recorded, and we'll put a link to that video up on the website as well. And you should definitely go watch that performance, because the performance by the singer is amazing. And also, you get a bonus performance from our very own Mukaddas in that video. So that's very fun to watch as well. So that's a really interesting example, I think, because it's a more contemporary poem, right? You said that those words were written 50 years ago or so, so much newer than the previous example we heard, which was from 500 years ago.
Mm.
But in some ways, it still feels maybe a little bit more like a traditional example because it is sung the way the earlier example we heard was sung as well, and meant to be shared through music, through that kind of experience, but talking about a much more contemporary subject, talking about this feeling of exile and missing the homeland, which feels much more, even though it is a 50-year-old example, still feels very current, and maybe even more current, maybe even more poignant hearing it now, today in 2021.
It is. It is really deeply emotional to me. I love the song, and I have been listening to it many, many times, and I still love how much emotion that can provoke in me. And also, I'm discovering some of the very young poets are doing the same. Like, they're writing poetry about homeland, about missing homeland, and about nostalgia, and it's also having a same effect on me every time when I listen to their poetry. And also I asked Josh if he's interested in like young poets' work and if he's translating some of their work, and he said yes, and then he's really excited and also very hopeful about how young Uyghur poets outside of Uyghur homeland is relentlessly working on Uyghur poetry and expressing and continuing this very long tradition of using words, using poetic verses to document their emotions. It's really interesting.
Is there a specific example he gave of a younger poet in the diaspora now that he found really interesting?
He mentioned several poets. There's Merdan, there's Hendan, there are many more. And also I talked to these two young poets in the diaspora, and I collected really interesting conversations with them, and I would like to share with you today.
So first, we will hear you have a conversation with Merdan. Is that right?
Yes, and Merdan and his poetic journey is really interesting and really unconventional, I would say, because um, that also shows us that Uyghur poetry has much more creative space than any other form, artistic form that Uyghur society have been cultivating. And the poetic creativeness that these young people are pushing so far is really interesting, because Merdan is a member, or like was a member of this very interesting movement called Nothingism. And he explained me what was Nothingism and how he came to write poetry in this school of Nothingism.
And just a quick note for our audience, Mukaddas interviewed Merdan in Uyghur. So what you'll be hearing is a translation of that interview performed by an actor.
Hi Merdan, could you please introduce yourself?
Yaxshimisilar do'stlar? Mening ismim Merdan Ehet'eli. Men bir Uyg'ur.
Hi, my name is Merdan Ehet'eli. I'm a Uyghur.
Can you please tell me about how you came to be a poet?
There is a difference between having the title of poet and the being a poet. There is no comparison, really. I feel strange when someone calls oneself a poet. For me, someone who writes poetry is someone who is documenting poetic ideas. When someone says the phrase, I'm a poet, at that moment, that person is not doing anything related to poetry. That moment is not when you are making art, but a moment where you are just talking.
So, what can you tell me about the Nothingism poetic movement? I don't know much about this movement.
Nothingism was a poetic movement that happened in Urumqi in the late 2000s, maybe around 2009. It came out of some poetic reform that happened back in the 80s when people were interested in the reforming poetic language. Poet at that time became more interested in the philosophical thinking. But now it has finished. Passan was one of the main poets of that movement, but by 2013, he had already changed direction in his expression.
But while it was happening, what was it about? What was the philosophical thinking of you mentioned?
It was a kind of call for reflection, a call for poetical expression. Its contribution to Uyghur philosophy was to remind us once again that existence equals nothing. There is a specificity about nothingism. Any poetic movement has its own style and an idea about what can be expressed through poetry. All movements have their own ideas about what is poetry, what is its structure. They reflect on these questions and they try to find the answers. The nothingismists reflected on the question of what can poetry express. And their response was that poetry can express nothing. Let me explain. The poetry that belongs to nothingism movement addresses what we call the nothing. The nothing is another name of existence in Uyghur poetic language. It is empty and full. It includes the present and the absence at the same time. It's everything and it's nothing in the exact same moment. This is a deep reflection about existence and the being. What we are talking about is probably the truth that philosophers were talking about, or that the prophets of the gods were talking about. It's the one thing, we just call it the nothing.
So, you see Nothingism as a as fitting into a larger philosophical tradition, isn't it?
Yes, for nothingismists, in all poetry history, all poets try to say the same thing. It's just that their way of saying it is different. Uh, Maybe they will use different words to name it. All poets describe our existence in different ways, but we believe we are all talking about the same thing. Furthermore, nothingism says that all poets are nothingismists, even if they don't call themselves that, because all poets are interested and expressing their existence. So all poets are talking about the nothing. So they are all nothingismists, even if they don't know it.
That's a lot to understand. So, if that is the philosophy behind Nothingism, what are you trying to express through your poetry?
Poets don't invent or express things which don't already exist. I don't write things that are not there. I just create verbal manifestation of my thoughts that are poetic thoughts. I just write them down. A poem is not an expression or an interpretation of another idea. The poem that I wrote is exactly what happened in my brain. The written poem is the dead form of my living thoughts. The nothingizmists believe that only poetic thoughts are the true thought, and anything that we think about for this outside in deep inside us is a poetic thought. It's not that these thoughts came from a specific space in our body, but they do came from a space that we could described as having specific shape, and that shape is what we call poetry.
So if nothingism is finished, what are you working on now?
Okay. I got into poetry by reflecting on nothingism. I was struck by the idea of nothingness. So I started to document my thoughts. That was a beginning for me. It shaped me, but I finished that school of thought. Now I'm doing a different thing. Just like how after you finish your school, go to find a different job. I was a young sprout who grew out the school of nothingism because the nothing brought me to the idea of existence, and the reflecting on the existence brought me to an even wider and even more colorful place.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wow, Merdan seems like a really interesting and philosophical guy. That was a really cool conversation. Thank you for sharing that. I'm struck by how he described this poetical movement that he was a part of, nothingism, as being over. Being a movement that had its place, its time in history, but all of the people who sort of ascribed to that have moved on. And that makes me wonder about examples of writers and poetic movements in the Uyghur diaspora that are alive and active and exciting right now. Are there any poets like that you've been able to talk with?
Yeah, that's the most exciting part for me for the subject about Uyghur poetry because there's many young poets in the diaspora. They're still using this form of art and expressing themselves, expressing their feelings about home, about trauma, and about nostalgia. And I also talked to Josh about this matter, and he suggested Muyesser Hendan. She's also a very strong figure living in Turkey. She is an educator. She opened up a language school. She has a foundation for helping Uyghur language to continue to be spoken, to be learned for the younger generation living in outside of homeland. And also she's a writer and poet. And she writes like really strong poetry, and her poems are there's a kind of sense of urgentness and sense of immediate feeling. She pushes out like things that she has been living or putting through, and also not only her own feelings. I think most of her poetry is also about how the diaspora community is living and experiencing. And she's a very modest person, and she told me like most of her poetry is available on social media. That's her medium. Actually, she writes poetry and then she will just put it out there for people to read it and to feel what she's going through. And I talked to her, and that was a very interesting conversation as well.
Sure, my name is Muyesser Hendan is my pen name. I was born and raised in Golja. My mother was a high school teacher and my father studied medicine, but later he ran his own business as he was not allowed to be a doctor after Cultural Revolution. I studied medicine in Peking University and then did my master's in public health in University of Malaya. Since I came to Turkey in 2013, I've been living here focusing on teaching, writing, editing books, and magazines.
You are doing a lot of amazing work.
Thank you.
I'm interested in also your name, Handan. Why you choose this pen name for yourself and how you choose it, and can you explain what does that mean?
Handan means, originally it's a Persian word. It means laugh or laughing.
Oh,
I got it from Navai's poetries. I love this word actually. It sounds great for me, and it means a joy. So,
um, how long have you been using this pen name?
I've been using it since 2004, I think.
So, Miyasser, which is your favorite poem that you wrote?
It's very hard to decide, but if I had to choose, I'd say "Otның içiga qaytish," returning to the fire or back into the flames, as Joshua translated. I wrote this poem when the news of Abdurrahimid's death was spread. I didn't have the chance to know him personally, but I always respected him and loved every single work of him. So at the time, I was extremely sad and felt helpless. So I didn't manage to suppress the strong emotion and wrote the poem. I normally write poems when I feel like writing, but this one is one of the few pieces written at the very moment that it was necessary to write.
Mukaddas, can I just ask for a little more information about the person you and Hendan are talking about here at this point in the conversation?
Yes, the entire poem was written after we heard a rumor about the disappearance of Abdurrahim Hayit. He's a very interesting and unique musician who made the art of playing dutar in a really different level than any other dutar player that the whole entire Uyghur community knows. He has this very special technicality when he plays dutar, which is a two-string instrument, a traditional instrument. And also he can really express really deep emotions and deep roots to this culture by playing just this two-string instruments. And that level of devotion to one instrument is really rare. Of course, he's not the only one, but his techniques and his way of expressing himself through music is really unique in Uyghur artistic scene. Could you please read it to me? I would like to listen to it and share it with our audiences.
Hendan will recite her poem Back into the Flames in the original Uyghur. The English version, translated by Joshua Freeman and recited by Mukaddas, is available on our website, uygurstories.com.
Otның içiga qaytish. Qaytaman uning yeniga, ularning yeniga. Uxlayolmaydi baribir bu ko'zlarim, har kunim kecha. Eqib ketyotidi barmoqlarimda yulduzlarim. O'ltirib ko'zimni yumay menmi uning bilan billa, qari bassun, qari zindonlarni mening tushlarim kulsun bir chetda. Qo'llarim bog'lansun mayli, yurakim yana bir qitim dog'lanmasin. Yüzümge urulsun qamça, boğulalmaz bunundan artıq, kötürelmez ruhimdeki arğamça. Yığlıman zinhar, öldü desi meni xəbərlər, soğuqdın, açlıqdın, ussuzluqdın, kimlikimnin yoxsuzluqidin, qutulubdu dəng. Yürekinizdən bir tal taşını elibitin, yenikləng. Yum yığlaşqa öşlüküm bilet alıdı. Taram tökülüştün bizarlıqım somkamni tartıdı. İçimni qamallıgan musibet tomurlarımni qoyuvetip aram tapıdı. Örümçi degende beşimdeki qapqara xalta kepellikim anamның mazırıga çapıdı. Neme degen rahat muşundaq ketişmi bir ölmey turup tayaqlardı muratqa yetişmi. Öldü desi meni yuchun xəbərlər ölmediden vatan tuprağıda ölemdi kişi, öz öyüdek çın kucaklap appaq topini, külümsüreştur emdi onun işi.
It's a really strong poem. Thank you for sharing. I feel this tremendous fire in you, and this poem is a kind of expression of that power, that fire. You have that fire in you. And I feel like this poem is saying many things at the same time. And it is, in a sense, trying to bring out what you're feeling really deep down. I'm really interested in, like, the whole episode that we're trying to put up together is really around this idea of how poetry is important for Uyghur society and how Uyghurs since many centuries used poetry to express their deeper emotions and how it's really the best way that they communicate with each other. And I feel that also strongly in your poetry. It is like something that you cannot really tell it with the simple words or like when you are giving a talk or when you're talking to someone, but it is expressed in a very poetic way. And can you please elaborate on that about like why do you think poetry is a better way of expressing deep emotions?
I believe everyone has their own way of expressing their emotions. Mine is mainly poetry. If you look back on our history, our heroes like Sadr Palwan and heroines like Nuzugum were poets at the same time. They expressed their emotions as well as recorded the history they were in by the means of poetry. And in Uyghurs' daily lives, poetry is something very common, from the children's game to the funeral poems. So I'm not sure if poetry is a better way of expressing deep emotions for everyone, but I believe that it's for us. I wrote most of my poetry in a very short time, so at the time I write, I just focus on recording the emotion. It's a better way for me because poetry captures and reflects emotions as well as it releases the emotions. I felt relieved after finished writing, and it works like a therapy for me.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you and I
Mhm.
we all know that Uyghur society is not a very communicative society. We don't talk much about our deeper emotions,
Yes.
like all the poetry that Uyghur culture have been cultivated, whether it's sang in a song or whether it's spoken or read by or written by poets, contemporary poets. We always like all our poetic expression is really rich and really emotional, which is
Mhm.
really the contrary of like how we are as a community, how we communicate with each other. We're deeply emotional when it's come to poetry, and as you said, it's like a therapy. I believe in that. I think it's not only for the poets who wrote those poems, but it's also for Uyghurs or the people who understand
Yes.
these poetry, how they listen to
Mhm.
it. And the emotional part expressed in poetry is such an important part for our culture, our people,
Mhm.
and our minds. And it's really amazing how you're perpetuating this culture and how you're using poetry to communicate all these really complicated, complex, deep emotions. I'm really admirer of your work, actually.
Thank you.
And I think I want to also dig a little bit deeper in this emotional expression of poetic writing. And for you, as a young, uh, active Uyghur in the diaspora, what kind of emotion do you want your readers to feel from your poetry? And what is, I don't know if you have any intention about your poetry and what do you want to convey using your poetry to wider audience, not only Uyghurs, but I know that many of your poem is
Mhm.
translated into English. And what is, do you have any sense of what kind of feelings or emotions or any understanding that your readers can take from your poetry?
Main readers are Uyghurs, so most of times I want to deliver the hope that I'm still holding. Whether what I write is sad or happy, I wish that they can get some strength after reading. Sometimes I cannot control my sadness and write something really depressing, but I never intend to depress people. I still wish them to look for some hope in it. In this particular situation we are in, I believe the most important thing is to be optimistic and strong, as we have a lot to do for our brothers and sisters left behind. So I don't think poetry has a mission to educate people. Rather, it's a way of releasing one's emotion at that very moment as other forms of art. So no matter what kind of hardship we're going through, I insist on writing poetry as an art, and art is always a very important tool for freedom fighters. So, for the wider audiences, I want them to know that Uyghurs are not a weak nation, but rather they are freedom fighters.
I cannot agree more, and thank you very much for sharing all this.
Thank you, too.
All the projects that you're doing and all the projects that I'm doing is also to share with the world that we are not weak.
Yes.
We are not just traumatized people, but we are also very vibrant, and we have this rich culture, like rich artistic culture that we can share with the world, with the humanity. So thank you very much for sharing all this.
Thank you, too.
If I understood correctly, your poetry is something to do with like catching some feelings that you're feeling deeply and
Yes.
putting them, delivering them as a poetry, right? It is really similar to
Yes.
sometimes how
Mhm.
I um also create some work, music or dance. It's like sometimes I feel some kind of feelings from what I'm seeing, what I'm going through, or what I'm reading, or what I'm suffering from. And I feel like I need to do something.
Yes.
And by doing like creative work,
Mhm.
exteriorize my feelings and I
Mhm.
put them into a kind of art form. It is always related to, as you said,
Yes.
recording some kind of moments or kind of feelings.
Yes. Exactly. Music, poetry are all kinds of art. So I think art should be like that.
Mm.
Not something that you should write when you want to, but you should write when something inside you wanted you to write.
I really like the way she reads her own poetry because she gets lighted up, like a fire.
Yeah. Yeah, you could hear it in her voice. The level of energy and sort of just engagement went to the next level. It was beautiful to hear her read her own work.
Yeah. Because the poetry for Uyghur writers or Uyghur audiences, it's really something really emotional, which cannot be fully expressed in a full sentence or a discourse or in a text. Poetry has a different emotional impact on um, Uyghur readers or Uyghur audience because it gives the Uyghur poets to express themselves and say things that they cannot be able to express in other forms. And it can also be really controversial by that sense. It can really say things transgressional.
Mm.
So they can also invoke or call for a kind of deeper emotional reflection. So the role of poetry, it has been a very important one in that sense for Uyghur society because Uyghur society has a lot of rules. There's a very structured and well established taboos. So poetry it gives in a kind of free form sometimes for those thinkers, those poets to have a space to say things truly as it comes and as it gets out of their thinkings, their emotional states.
I think it's wonderful that not only does poetry provide a format for people to have and express those kinds of thoughts or feelings, but because poetry is so central and so important within Uyghur culture, it also offers an audience for those feelings and those emotions to be communicated. Um, And, when I think about sort of the idea of a broad-reaching audience for poetry, and I was reflecting on what we talked about at the beginning of this episode about how, poetry doesn't necessarily have the same platform or the same prominence in America. I then started thinking about a recent example in the news of when poetry really was at the top headlines of American newspapers, and that was at the inauguration of President Joe Biden in January, when a young poet named Amanda Gorman recited her poem, "The Hill We Climb," and it was a beautiful poem, masterfully delivered, and it was a really unique cultural moment in America, I think, and I think it made news around the world. In France, you certainly
Yes.
were aware that it was happening. Like what you're saying about the poetry being revered within Uyghur culture for its ability to express something through an emotion that, would otherwise be difficult to convey, I think connects to an idea that so many Americans and people all over the world who heard her recite this work at the inauguration were so moved by that, and that it was able to capture a moment, to capture an emotionality, which, after months and months and months of political speeches and ideas being shared, and, talking about policies and how America can be better and so forth, people were sort of exhausted by that, but also very hungry for a poetic expression of some of those ideas, some of those same ideas, and new and other ideas. But that really, it seemed to resonate in a way that poetry doesn't seem to cut through in an American or a Western context. But maybe it's a great example of the role that it could be playing, a larger space in our society, and that maybe that's something that we should be looking to Uyghur culture for, and like perhaps there's lessons that we could be learning in terms of that kind of expression from this tradition that's been there for so long and been so central to the Uyghur cultural experience.
Yeah, I watched that video of Amanda Gorman, and I was also so moved and so touched, and I felt really close to her and to what she was expressing, because that conveyed the same emotion that I feel when I listen to Handan, when I listen to Tahir Hamud, another very well-known Uyghur poet who lives in Uyghur diaspora, and also Perhat Tursun, those poets, because essentially what they're trying to say is really crying out loud the inner voice of everyone, because everyone needs poetry, from the Western society, from America to France to Uyghur region, even in China, everyone craves for poetry because it's beautiful, it's really raw and immediate. So I think that's something that humankind should share and should use more often.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for sharing information about these amazing poets today from the Uyghur diaspora. And you mentioned a few other poets there at the end, Tahir Hamid, Parhat Tursun. We're going to put some information up on the website for audiences who would like to learn more about some of, not just the poets that you met in today's episode, but other amazing poets in the Uyghur poetic tradition, as well as English translations of some of the poems that you heard in today's episode. So thanks very much for sharing this all today with me, Mukaddas.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, and it was a really deep, emotional, and nice conversation as usual. Uyghur Stories is hosted by Mukaddas Mijit and John Bear. It is produced by The New While. Our audio engineer is Hasher. Our theme music was also composed by Hasher. Uyghur Stories is made possible with the support from the US Embassy in Paris. For more information, please visit us online at www.uighurstories.com. That is www.weghurstories.com. Of course, you can find us on Instagram at Uyghur Stories.